I tell everybody, if you were to take like my greatest hits in the military, it would play like a commercial for Saturday Night Live of just all the nonsense and whatnot I got into with the fellas.
A former Army recon sniper recalls the day in Iraq he was blown up in a Humvee as one of the most humorous events of his time in uniform.
I think a lot of that decision process just comes down to a lot of how you feel personally about like the risks, what's at stake, not necessarily what is going to make the most good, but just what is the best probable outcome. And hopefully that leads to better decisions and things that I could live with.
And on a different day in Iraq, providing overwatch for his squad, he must make a terrifying decision, whether without permission to take a long-distance shot that could save the lives of his squad. Hello. Welcome to the Mighty Pen Podcast. I'm David L. Robbins, your host and founder of the Mighty Pen Project, a free writing program for veterans and their families in partnership with the Virginia War Memorial Foundation here in Richmond, Virginia. Today, we feature a pair of stories by Charlie Williamson, a former 10th Mountain Recon Sergeant and an accomplished long-range marksman. Charlie writes about his war in Iraq and Afghanistan with charm and verve, as well as an eye for the funny and the macabre. You'll hear all that in our first story about chili. Afterward, Chuck and I will sit for an insightful talk on war and wit. This is Skyline, read by Alexander Sapp.
Hey, Sergeant. Commander's looking for some extra guns for the convoy later. Group leaves in an hour if you can spare anyone. It was an odd statement. We were 2 weeks from the deployment being over, and no one in their right mind was looking to take any more risks than we had to. Under usual circumstances, I would have rejected the mission outright this close to deployment being over. But convoy missions were usually pretty easy and offered the opportunity to take a quick jaunt over to the relative luxury of Baghdad International and hang out while the VIPs got settled before heading back to base. Worst ways to kill an afternoon was the prevailing thought at the time. 20 minutes later, I'd rounded up the section. I'd asked for volunteers, but since everyone wanted to go, cuts had to be made. I settled on the four of us. Our medic, Specialist Dunn. Our radio man, Skips. Bravo team leader, Specialist Lukasevich. And myself. It was a relatively simple mission. The four of us would go with 2nd Platoon to the airport, pick up some NATO officer, sample how the other half lived in the comfort afforded by the United States Air Force, then head on back for movie night. Skips had gotten a bootleg copy of Batman vs. Superman from one of the locals, so while we were out, everyone else was responsible for snack and beverage liberation. Meanwhile, Doc and I were on the hunt for a set of speakers the Air Force wouldn't miss too much. Ours had been damaged a few weeks prior in what was described to me as a dubstep incident. Whatever the case, audio would only be played from one side of the speakers on the TV, and bootleg copy or not, Batman vs. Superman demanded both audio channels in as high a quality as we could provide. We arrived at the motor pool well in advance of the 2nd Platoon to start getting ready. Our Humvee sat exactly where it had been since the last mission. In some long ago motor pool, someone had the bright idea to designate our truck with number 034TH, or in a much more cursory glance now that the paint was worn and chipped away, death. Naturally, it didn't take long for the name Death Wagon to stick, and in the superstitious world of the infantry, no one else but us were going near it. Additionally, as fitting our special assignment to reconnaissance, we've been gifted with a lot of extra equipment, including advanced communications gear, medical and trauma equipment, and miraculously, a sound system that would play CDs that no one outside of the section wanted to be responsible for damaging. We were further augmented with the comforts of home by a Yeti cooler we had mysteriously reappropriated. We were fully settled with the engine running when 2nd Platoon finally arrived and began mounting up. First squad would be the lead vehicle on the way there and back, with us second in line. Mission was to pick up a British Royal Air Force major and his escort and they would be sandwiched in between our lead team and rear elements. All total, we were 6 vehicles, plus whatever we would be picking up at the airport. Skips was driving, with me in the passenger seat, Doc in the back, and Luke on the gun. Assuming we followed posted traffic laws, it was about a 25-minute drive one way to Baghdad International. We would be there in 10, a milk run if there ever was one, and everybody knew it. As we started pulling out, I felt a tap on my shoulder and Doc handed me a CD, the section mixtape. Everyone had been allowed to pick 2 songs to have included on the CD. True to form in the military, it was the most outrageous thing any of us had ever listened to. I gave a slight chuckle as the Humvee speakers crackled to life and Megadeth's High-Speed Dirt filled the interior. The ride over was thankfully quiet, like we all knew it would be. If anything was going to happen, it would be on the way back after the pickup and the miles passed without incident. The route was relatively nondescript. Iraq as a nation is little more than flat desert connected by highways and the usual buildings, houses, and roadways around Baghdad weaved around like any major highway. We arrived right as Old Crow Medicine Show was finishing Wagon Wheel to find out the major we were picking up had his flight delayed by 20 minutes, and he was bringing a unit of Royal Marines with him. Suddenly questioning why we were here when the UK had already sent a unit of commandos with him, we parked next to the 2nd Platoon, and everyone got to work. Luke went over to mill about with 2nd Platoon while they were getting vehicles ready for the British, while Doc and I set off to find some quality speakers. Skips cracked open a cold Gatorade from the cooler and stayed with the truck to make sure none of our gear, and more importantly, snacks, went missing. 15 minutes later, I emerged back into the heat of the airstrip. The relative calm that had been present when we arrived had been shattered with the arrival of a C-17 Globemaster. The red and blue fin flashes of the Royal Air Force immediately recognizable on the otherwise gray exterior. Royal Marines in their green berets shuffled back and forth, unloading equipment into the waiting trucks with mechanical efficiency. In the middle of it, a British major was talking to 2nd Platoon's platoon leader and platoon sergeant. I quickly found my way back to the Scout Section's Humvee. My look-through had been uneventful as the Air Force was being rather stingy with their supply of sound gear, and I hoped Doc had had better luck. Already waiting for me at the Humvee, Doc took one look and flashed a smile like he knew a joke that he couldn't wait to tell me as he held up a small box in his right hand. In it was a full set of speakers and a subwoofer. You wouldn't believe it, Sergeant. You remember that airman from Wyoming I was trying to ask out after we rotated back? Well, she is a technical sergeant now, and... Doc's explanation, though riveting, was suddenly drowned out by the roar of 4 F-117 turbofan engines from the C-17 as it began idling away. We then got the word, mount up, we were leaving in 2 minutes. Doc's story would have to wait. He tucked the speakers next to him in the empty seat as we all mounted up into the death wagon. Woody's Roundup from the Toy Story 2 soundtrack played as we left. The ride back on VIP detail was always more stressful than the ride over. The reason being, no matter who the VIPs were, it was always going to be a big deal if something happened to them on the way back to the green zone. None of the higher-ups wanted to have to explain to NATO or the general staff that there had been an incident involving a foreign national. The conversation with Her Majesty's Royal Air Force that the major they had sent over had been killed on our watch especially was bound to go over terribly. As such, everyone was understandably a little on edge. Everyone had their own way of dealing with it. Luke was doing his best to eat a can of Skyline chili he had somehow acquired before we got too far out and the dust made that task all but impossible, while Skips and Doc made guesses about how Batman vs. Superman was going to end. Doc had given up regaling us with the story of how he had gotten the speakers from the blonde airman from Wyoming, and thankfully didn't seem to be in much of a hurry to circle back to that. We were 2 miles out from the Al Amaria Bridge when everything fell apart. Traffic was forcing us to find an alternate route through the side streets back to the green zone. Skips, being our local expert, noticed it first. The streets, usually busy with midday activity, were oddly quiet and no foot traffic was out. Call went out over the radio to be on the lookout for small arms and roadblocks. I motioned for Luke to drop off the turret for a word, unaware that this small action would save his life 10 seconds from now. Doc's contribution to the mixtape, Seek and Destroy by Metallica, droned on in the background a world away while Luke took a seat in the back of the Humvee. An instant after the gun hatch closed, a warhead from RPG streaked across the road in front of us like a malevolent star come to Earth and collided with the road directly in front of us, cratering the street with sudden volume of a cannonade. Time passed in slow motion as everything happened at a fraction of its speed. Skips frantically tried to correct the course and avoid the new gap in the road from the rocket, as well as account for the change in travel from the lead vehicle. The high speed and low maneuverability of the Humvee was having none of it as we shifted left on the roadway. It was all for naught, though. On the right side, another explosion detonated and sent a shockwave through the truck, causing the windows to spiderweb and the truck to lurch suddenly to one side. The last thing I heard clearly was Doc yelling, "Brace!" An instant later, I heard no sound as everything went black. In my dream, I smelled barbecue. A great warmth washes over me. I think the sky is on fire. I feel an impossible combination of being weightless, but also impossibly heavy. I see someone I knew, or maybe that I don't know yet. They have the same color hair as someone I want to see again, but whose name I'm too sad to speak out loud. The figure calls to me. I don't answer. My thoughts scatter like ash on the wind as I move by roaring engine on the other side of the universe. An indeterminate amount of time later, I think I'm flying. In that universe, I hear screaming and the clash of metal on metal. Death at the gates again, I think. I hear someone howling my name. I try to reach a hand out in the dark toward a figure in the distance I think I recognize. The figure turns to me. It has no face, yet it smiled at me and shakes its head. I woke up. My vision swam, and as I opened my eyes to see the sky for what seems like the first time, I realized I'm being dragged somewhere. I looked up and recognized the two men pulling me away from the Humvee, but couldn't speak their names into existence. They spoke to me, but the ringing in my ears drowned out all the sounds. I felt like I was going to throw up food I hadn't even eaten yet. The strong taste of bile in my mouth made me think I already had. As I looked down, I could see both my arms and legs were still attached from where they should be, but they weighed 20 tons each. My face felt fuzzy, and I thought I was bleeding, but couldn't say from where. Still looking down, I was suddenly terrified at the sight that my brain finally got around to processing. Large metal shards and unknown fragments stick out from my chest at odd angles, covered in bread, bits of meat all over them. I wanted to grab them and pull them out, but my hands wouldn't cooperate. I thought I screamed. An instant later, Doc was by my side. I hoped he said I was going to be okay, but I can't tell for sure. The world goes dark again as everything overwhelms me. I jolt awake again to the sound of gunfire, like a man drowning, breaking the surface as I thrash in place against the ground. Around me, friendly faces go about the business of war. Adrenaline starts to force the clouds away from my mind, but I still feel 1,000 miles away. I tried to stand, but my legs gave out halfway through the effort, sending me crashing back down. Whatever gods governed the infantry had sensed my hubris and sent their greatest assassin, Murphy, after me. It was never going to be easy. I was now being taught a lesson in true cruelty. I was in the middle of an epic bout of internal berating for taking such a risk when a familiar tap on my shoulder brought me back to life, and I looked over to see Doc. He gave me a bit too cheery smile and offered me some water. I looked down. The metal was gone from my chest, and nothing seemed to be missing. How? Was all I could manage under the circumstances. Doc looked down at me like he had borne the cares of the world for a millennium. RPG hit the passenger side. Looked like a bad detonation, though, and that's why we're all still here. Best I can tell, force from the blast made you black out. You were out for a few minutes, Doc replies. Oh, and your body armor's toast. Looks like the plates and inserts shattered, but kept your chest from collapsing, so there's that. Other than you throwing up and a bloody nose, you should live. What about the meat on my chest I saw? Doc gave a grin like the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland and produced the remains of a can of Skyline chili from somewhere next to me. You can thank Luke for that. Got all over you and the rest of the interior. Whew. I breathed a heavy sigh of relief. I started to ask Doc where the rest of the section was, but before I could complete the sentence, Skips and Luke arrived as if summoned from the beyond. They looked battered and bruised, but otherwise unharmed as well. "Boss," Skip handed me my rifle. "How we doing?" "Commander's trying to get us some air support. Our higher-ups are having none of it. This close to air traffic from the terminal. Second platoon is holding around the VIP. First squad is around the corner. That shooting is mostly them. Last count was 4 hostiles up the street in a 2-story structure. What's the play?" "Well," I started as I unsteadily got to my feet with no small bit of help from Doc. "Not really a fan of people who try to blow me up, let alone my truck or you guys. Long as Doc doesn't mind violating the Geneva Convention, we got a fire team. What say we introduce ourselves?" "Hey, convention says I can defend myself, and they did shoot first." Doc picked up his rifle and cleared off some dust. The situation hadn't changed much by the time we reached first squad. I motioned for the team to hang back and moved up to assess in person, while Skips got back on the radio to try for some air support. First squad thankfully had some machine guns with them and were laying down an impressive amount of fire onto the building we were getting shot from. It was an unimpressive structure to begin with. Slightly smaller than a single-family home, and the fusillade from first squad had done little to improve its structural integrity. Having 4 guys was technically enough to clear a house, but it was by no means ideal. I was nowhere close to being ready to fight after having my head rattled, not to mention whatever was ailing everyone else. Further, we had no idea what the inside of the building was like. Closets, crawl spaces, as well as long hallways could spell disaster, especially in close quarters with so few of us, but there was little choice. Assessment complete, I went back to go over the plan with the rest of the team. Skips was buried in conversation with someone on the radio, and judging by the look, it was important enough not to interrupt. In the meantime, I looked over to Doc. "Didn't you say the blonde girl was a technical sergeant? Call her up to see if she can retask us something." Luke laughed. Doc looked like he wanted to punch me, but his face cracked an instant later into a smile. A second later, Skips finished his conversation and joined us. "So how's it looking, Skips?" Luke ventured as he joined the group. "Give it 30 seconds and we'll know," was all Skips offered in return. With 30 seconds to kill, I went over the plan of action. It was simple, but pretty much the best we could do under the circumstances. All of us were going to advance up undercover from first squad. Once we reached the door, breach and clear, then room to room. All targets inside to be considered hostile. If need be, we can split in 2 teams of myself and Doc, and Luke and Skips. I was asking for questions from anyone when Skips' 30 seconds elapsed. As if on cue, we felt the ground shake from the approach of aircraft. We turned around to the sight of 2 AH-64 Apache attack helicopters flying up the street towards us. From behind me, all I heard was, "Just wanted to make sure you had a plan, Sergeant," before the sound of 2 autocannons tore the building to shreds behind us and drowned out all other sounds. All that came to mind was, hell of a milk run.
That was Skyline, read by Alexander Sapp. I'm joined by the author, Charlie Williamson. Charlie, as you know, after 8.5, 9 years of teaching the Mighty Pen class, that paragraph you wrote while you're unconscious after the IED strikes your Humvee may be my favorite paragraph. Walk me through what went through your mind when you're writing the paragraph, but if you can take yourself back to that moment, how authentic was that? Is that what it was like being unconscious? Did you see a woman whose name you were too sad to speak? Did you feel floating in an ethereal universe? It was such a beautiful paragraph.
Thanks, Dave. Happy to be here, by the way. So as far as the authenticity, it's kind of an amalgamation of both a few experiences personally, but also of some other folks, the way they described some things, traumatic experiences, other stuff like that. It kind of flowed better, and that's what I was looking for, being that sort of amalgamation of this was all happening at separate times to separate people, but kind of coming together. As far as the authenticity, in the moment, not so much, but later on, when I was going through a lot of the recovery and whatnot, that was more waking up from recovery in the hospital and everything when I had to get back stateside, and when I was recovering from that, it was more resemblant of that than anything in the moment.
Hard to find real comedy in combat. Yet there you are, knocked silly, your crew looking at you like, okay, wake up. And you wake up and your pressure plate's all broken. You're covered in meat. Now, there are existential moments, in life, and I'm sure in combat they're frequent, but that's such a beautiful distillation of crisis. You look down and it's chilly. And I just have to ask you to recreate that for me right now. Can you go back there and give me some extra details, some extra insights into what that must be like?
I tell everybody, if you were to take like my greatest hits in the military, it would play like a commercial for Saturday Night Live of just all the nonsense and whatnot I got into with the fellas. But I think most people, if you get into service like that, especially with combat arms and the infantry as a whole, a lot of the time is just you and the boys, like Friday nights, just doing whatever. And a lot of that camaraderie and things just stick with you even through training and overseas and operationally and all that stuff. As far as the exact moment, again, going back to waking up and everything, it was as close to kind of like an out of body experience as I can describe it. It was almost like events were happening, but they weren't happening to me. It can't be me or it can't be Doc or anybody. It's something on television. I'm seeing this in a video game. It's not me or anyone I care about. This is happening well far away from anything relevant to now. I had no fallback on that. I had zero experience with significant bodily harm like that. So it was just like, huh, this is new and I don't know how to experience this. So the childlike brain kicked in and was like, this is a new thing. Let's explore it. Okay, I don't want to stick this in my mouth, but let's try and touch it.
You were 10th Mountain Recon. Yep.
So my last duty station was 10th Mountain Division. Yes, sir. And I spent some time doing a bunch of different things. The one I'm most proud of was my time, and limited as it was, in the reconnaissance section for 10th Mountain. Yes.
And you served in Iraq.
I served all over the place overseas and, all those good things.
Okay. You joined the military. At what age?
Oh, gosh. I enlisted when that would have been 20. I was 22.
All right. What took you to the military? At 22, what were you doing until 22?
So that was a series of misadventures, which I call my starving artist phase. I had finished high school and went off to college in upstate New York, did medical school pre-med for a year, got hit with the tuition bill and decided that I didn't want to do extended medical school forever because the debt was going to be prohibitive to some other things I wanted to do in life, like make money. So we came back to Virginia, got involved in some movie and theatrical productions locally.
You were an extra in Lincoln.
I was cast and crew and also an extra, yes, but we don't need to talk about my 14.2 seconds of walking towards camera, but I was props, set deck, and special effects for Lincoln, did some other things for about a year. Then I went off to trade school in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, going to gunsmith school to try and be the set guy. We call it the weapons wrangler on set, but just the guy in charge of like anytime there's a gun on film set, just be that guy. And so I did that for about a year and a half. And then after that, I came once again back to Virginia, trying to make that work, trying to figure stuff out. And I had run out of money at the time, didn't really have a lot of great career prospects. So it was at the point where I needed to hit the reset button on my life. And there were only so many ways I could do that. So I decided, I guess we'll just go join the Army. So I took a good friend of mine. He was at Fort Lee at the time teaching something. I forget what. But for those of you listening, thinking about joining any of the services, take like a senior officer, NCO, somebody with you, because I walked in with a uniformed major to the recruiting station, had everybody locked up at attention when he walked in. And I sat down in front of the recruiter. He sat behind me, and nobody could lie to me or try and, spin a yarn, as we would say.
Good advice. Last question. You wound up an expert in arms. I guess is a general way to put it. You became a sniper.
So technically they called it the designated marksman. It's one of those things, Dave, where everybody in the military is just like, things that we do don't make sense to a lot of people if you accurately describe them. So the easier way to say things is yes, but for all the, folks at home, like I didn't go to sniper school. I had a lot of good mentors who we did a lot of time on the flat range and everything. And ballistics was something I knew a lot about before I joined the Army. So it was kind of like the natural choice for me to just be the designated marksman for stuff.
And now, Charlie Williamson's award-winning short story about snap decisions in combat and their lasting impact. This is The Sphere, read also by Alexander Sapp.
Time behind the sniper rifle was an odd thing. If ever there was a way to slow the river of time, it was to put the scope in front of you. I always knew it couldn't have been longer than a minute, but it felt like a year. The longer the years went on, every moment got longer and stretched out like grains of sand in a shrinking hourglass. Ralph, Luke, and I had only been there for 5 hours, but it felt like an eternity. Behind me, Ralph was getting restless on the radio. "You mind if I smoke real quick?" "And what if we get an important call?" Luke quipped. "Like that brunette who's the cardiac surgeon decided to give you another chance. Also, I thought you quit." "1,000 apologies, my liege lords. With the crown's permission, I will indulge in a small pleasure I may not have again." Luke let out a short laugh next to me, and Ralph retreated to the opposite end of the room. Under normal conditions, I would have told him to wait till we had finished operations, but the hours on Overwatch were taking it out of all of us. The dingy brown and lack of furniture in the room didn't exactly provide much to look at either, but it was an abandoned house on a hill with an intact roof and a large hole in the wall I could view the operational area from. The street below was quiet. Alpha Company wasn't scheduled to be there for another few minutes for presence patrol to remind the militants we were still very much in charge. We had done dozens of them in the last month and nothing ever happened, yet the captain had still asked for sniper support. Lacking an excuse, Luke, Ralph, and I were now spending the day looking for trouble, or kicking sand looking for landmines, as I had once called it. The smell of burning tobacco filled the room. I turned. Ralph sat against the wall, cigarette in one hand. In his other, the Zippo lighter continued to burn. For a moment, I watched the Zippo flame dance in the afternoon light. Something in the primal brain responded to fire like that. The more tired you were, the greater the call of the flame. At some point, I noticed Luke joined me, and Ralph seemed to have forgotten to close the lighter as well. Something about fire always made people stare at it. I gave myself a quick mental slap and got back behind the gun. Below us, Alpha Company had arrived. Directly ahead of them was the city mosque, its dome structure dominating the landscape. It was an ornate structure, high columns and few windows to let the worshippers practice without the eyes of the world looking in. There was only one window I could clearly see. Inside, figures I couldn't make out moved around. One passed the window and my stomach dropped as I saw what looked like a rifle in his hands. Overwatch at that point in the war was largely pointless. Luke and I were so constrained by rules of engagement that we basically had to have a militant shoot 5 people in front of us before I could take a shot. God help you if you caused any property or civilian damage. Months of goodwill effort, as well as USAID funding, meant that any damage to important structures like schools or mosques would be a significant setback for nation building, and you could expect anything from a congressional hearing to demotion and court-martial if you were responsible. Luke, focus up. Spotter scope now. Need eyes on the dome. Directly ahead, left side window next to the door. Need you to tell me what you see. Oh, fuck. Is that dudes with AKs? I need distance. Roth, radio the captain. Let him know he's about to get lit up. After that, get the colonel. Tell him he can either authorize whatever I'm about to do, or I'll sign the paperwork and see him at my court-martial at a later date. As if on cue, the whip crack of a single shot rang out and one of the window panes shattered. Moments later, the doors of the mosque flew open. Militants ran out. With my unaided eye, I couldn't see their faces or hands, but could see guns and arms. At 300 yards, you couldn't see human hands with the unaided eye. Doorway, got a runner. Is that a vest? Luke's sentence might have sounded like a question, but it didn't need an answer. The crosshairs swept over the figure. The reptilian part of my brain kicked in as I saw the same thing. It became kill or be killed. To my right, Luke had answered his own question and was already calling out range modifications and adjustments. Numbers the lizard brain could understand and recognize as important, but were deemed unnecessary. I could hear Roth behind me, but processing what he was saying was likewise deemed unimportant. The bomber almost to the door now. I settled in on a point that I thought would be square on his chest and took the slack out of the trigger. If I was as good as I like to pretend I was, the shot would blow out a spinal column, or at the very least make him stumble a bit. The trigger wall broke, and there was a slight twinge against my shoulder as I sent a .30-inch ogive on a journey to terminal ballistics. Downrange, my gaze held on a figure in the doorway as if I was looking at the very origin of creation itself. The silhouette of the man jerked bolt upright as if possessed by some kind of divine power. For an instant, I thought he was looking for me. And then he started to fall over as his brain tried to process being dead. Lacking input, his other hand relaxed and he dropped the detonator. It never hit the floor, and the figure disappeared. In its place was a miniature sun whose arrival was punctuated by the sonic boom of an explosion that blew out every window on its journey outward. On its heels, a perfect sphere of the fireball spilled out the now open windows and set out to consume the world. The dome cracked and the world shook. The remaining militants scattered and ran off. Then, as quickly and violently as it arrived, it was gone. Inside, countless small fires raged as the upholstery ignited. You see anyone else? Nah, ground troops are moving in to secure. Great shot, though. Luke Raff and I just looked at the fires. Something about fire always makes people stare at it.
That was The Sphere, written by Charlie Williamson, read by Alexander Sapp. Chuck, that moment came in that story. It was, as you said, kill or be killed, shoot or risk the safety of your friends in the squad in the street. Can you take me back to that moment and revisit that? That's a huge turning point in any young man's life to have the courage and the maturity to make that call. Years later, how does that resonate with you?
So, another Mighty Pen friend, Robert Waldroff, asked me, what I'd thought about a lot of these things years on. And unfortunately, I still to this day don't have a great answer. As best I can tell you, Dave, this was described to me by a good friend of mine who taught me a lot of what I know about marksmanship and just shooting over distance. He told me once that you have to, when you're shooting distance, take yourself out of the equation. And what he meant by that was this becomes about the process. You do all your math, your trigonometry, your wind calculations, your distance, bullet grain, velocity, all those things that everybody in the movies, oh, we got to take into account the Coriolis effect and the turn of the earth and everything. That you do all those calculations, and then it becomes the success of the process. It's mostly binary. I tried to always keep it about the success of the process rather than the end result, just because that is the end result in any situation like that is doing horrible, horrible things to your fellow man. And that's something that I know a lot of friends that I have struggled with in the wake of things they did overseas or things of that nature.
On behalf of the people listening, their curiosity is the same as mine for all those of us who are never going to be in that position when you have to decide your own safety, stay within the rules, the protocols. You did not have permission for that shot, yet you took it at no small amount of professional and, let's just even say, ethical risk. What made you decide to pull the trigger and not wait for permission?
As Timothy Oliphant in the show Justified once famously said, I was justified. I the decision-making process, there wasn't a whole lot of it. Folks overseas and both that I knew, didn't know, will never know, they're confronted every day with split-second decisions like that. I mean, even domestically, we've got folks, first responders, serious folks out there in danger making a lot more difficult decisions than I do. I think a lot of that decision process just comes down to a lot of how you feel personally about like the risks, what's at stake. Similarly, I tried to keep that to a lot of the decisions I made in the military. Not necessarily what is going to make the most good, but just what is the best probable outcome. And hopefully that leads to better decisions and things that I could live with.
Being the designated marksman, which the layman like myself would call a sniper, it's a remarkable combination of two components of combat. There's distance, almost like it's artillery, yet because of the magnification of the scope, there's an intimacy. You have to lean on both to do the job, right?
It's more like golf. You got to have distance and direction.
Okay. Emotionally, though, when it's done, when the job's done, you have been skin close to that target. What do you take away?
That I don't have a good answer for, to be honest with you, Dave. I think a lot of folks, especially in my generation of the military, we take different things. In talking with a lot of the Vietnam vets, they've all had different experiences with, for lack of a better phrase, their war. And the universal thing is I was content with my conflict. I would rather be in Korea, Europe, the Cold War, Vietnam, whatever, than in Iraq, Afghanistan. Meanwhile, my generation, it's we were not necessarily fine, but we will take Iraq and Afghanistan over Vietnam any day of the week because that's just the whole Vietnam conflict is just horrifying to most of us in general. So I think a lot of it just is, again, back to personal, like what you personally take from things and what your support network is like. Unfortunately, with just everything with the global war on terror, it's becoming a lot more fractured for the service folks nowadays. A lot of it is, well, I was in, this battalion doing this stuff on this day. And it's self segregating, for lack of a better phrase. Unless you were with somebody and they were right next to you on that day for whatever operation was going on. Oh, well, you had it easy. It's the dumbest argument of the I had to go uphill to school both ways, 20 miles in the snow. Oh, you went to basic training at Bravo 254? Oh, well, I was Charlie Company 254 Infantry at Fort Benning. We had it way worse than you. I got way less sleep and we had way more field problems. Oh, you were, 75th Ranger? Well, I was 3rd Special Forces Group. We had it way harder than you. And I get that there's a lot of individual pride in your unit, your experience and everything, but the issue becomes when we are so wrapped up in our own personal like view of conflict and our unit, our squad mates, our fellas, like they're the only ones who, were looking out for me. That's setting yourself up for failure because there are a lot more folks, if you just look at it, who would be interested in hearing about your experiences or what you took away from things. I think just there's a struggle for kind of a struggle for meaning for a lot of folks now, especially in the wake of the withdrawal from Afghanistan not being what anybody, I think, was hoping for. And so a lot of us are just asking now, like, was it worth it? And what do I do now? And those are big, broad questions that we as humans have been trying to answer for pretty much forever.
Which is shared with the Vietnam generation.
Exactly.
Same question.
But we're all trying to find that answer. And when I find it, I'll be sure to let you know.
Last question for you, my brother. What did the Army make of you? Who are you now because you served?
It's hard to say, what the Army made of me, because I want to be, just like, oh yeah, I gave however many, days, months, hours, minutes of my life to the military, and we got out and they didn't appreciate my service, but I served my nickel or whatever. But at the end of the day, like, it's hard to bash it. Like, I've got good friends from my time in service. I got a lot of good educational benefits. The GI plan is great and everything. But to me, it was more of just like a moment in time. And I get to go back to that moment and, reminisce with friends and fellow veterans and you for a lot of the, stories, fictional or otherwise, because military stories are a lot like fishing stories. The fish, every time you tell it, just keeps getting bigger. It goes from, 5 guys to 10 guys to 30 in a firefight. And we had air support and, no, we were out there for 12 days. No, 19 days, 52 days. I didn't have water or anything. All I had was my MRE spork, and it was super cool, but it's a classified mission and I can't tell you about it now. I guess what the Army made of me is just more of like a concerned citizen for America, because all the folks who typically do well in the military are guys and gals who have had like a lot of structure prior to the military. So it kind of just takes a lot of those things and either makes them better or amplifies them. The thing in the military is always like time management and just being focused on you, the guys, and providing leadership where you can.
I know when you got out of the military, first thing you did was you attended my alma mater, William and Mary, graduated. Then you went back to business school to my alma mater, William and Mary, and graduated. And I'm just sure that the United States Army was in there somewhere. You don't perform that well without this kind of training, I think.
Yeah, we'll give them some credit, but shout out to you and my mom. I had good coaches on the way.
All right. Chuck, my brother, good to have you in here, buddy. Thank you. The Mighty Pen Project is a free writing program for military veterans and their families, offered by the Virginia War Memorial Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit. If you'd like to learn more about the Mighty Pen or just send us your thoughts, email us at mppodcast@vawarmemorial.org or use the link in the podcast description. If you're a veteran or a family member of a serviceman or woman listening to this podcast anywhere in America, and you want to learn how to best write and tell your own powerful stories, you can sign up for one of our Mighty Pen writing workshops on Zoom. If you want to read today's pieces by Charlie Williamson and many more, use the link to the Mighty Pen archive. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it. Music for this episode was provided by Jackson Albrecht. Lastly, if you'd like to support the Mighty Pen's efforts to record and preserve these stories of service, adventure, and sacrifice, follow the charitable donation link in the podcast description. I'm David L. Robbins, and I want to thank you for listening to the Mighty Pen Podcast. It's an honor.